Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. As promised, today I'm going to go over a bunch of different mixing things that I found out in the mixing sessions that I did for my album. Some of these mixing sessions were streamed live, but some weren't, and I just want to go over a few interesting techniques that I found while doing these mixes. I was actually going to name this 5 different mixing tips, but I found another one which I find very interesting and very important while I was setting up this recording. So I'm not going to do like a top 5 list or something like that. I just want to run down a few of the different interesting things that I found while doing these mixes. So diving right into the first one here, this is the last mixing session that I did for the album. This is the last track number 13 from the album. And I did this one live. And what I found was that my kick and my bass really weren't sitting right in the mix. So I'm going to turn off these 2 EQs to just let you hear how the kick and bass were sitting originally before I talk about these 2 EQs. It really feels boxy and it feels like the kick and bass are really fighting for the same space. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to take the kick and just kind of take its sub and put it lower, put it below the sub of the bass. And in order to do that, we have these 2 EQs here. So what we have is we have a first EQ, which is just cutting out around the 100 Hz area. And you can see this is a pretty drastic cut. It's minus 10 dB. I had to do a lot of cutting and a lot of boosting to actually get this kick to fit. That, together with some of the other things that I did here just to clean it up and to get a little bit of extra tone out of 1K here, is the first EQ. And the second EQ really is where the magic happens. So let's have a look at the second EQ. I'm going to activate it and open it up. Here you can see a Pultec emulation that I'm using to reshape the lower end. So apart from this boost here, which is just a boost at 2K to get some tone out of that, the real focus should be on this band, and especially the gain here. So what you'll see is that I have 10 dB of gain on 20 Hz, which is a crazy setting. But what this did for me was it created a curve in combination with this other EQ that kind of took all of the energy that was sitting at around 100 Hz and kind of pushed it down lower. So you can imagine taking all of the content that is sitting in this part of the spectrum, removing it by 10 dB and then pushing it back up in this space here. Now the reason why I say this space and not 20 Hz, which is sitting right here, is because when you're boosting on an EQ, you're not just boosting that individual frequency. Say we have like a peak, we're boosting around the frequency. Now knowing how an EDM kick works, we just have like this sine wave which is pitch sweeping down. So if there's no problems, if there's no rumbles, no annoying frequencies in the lower range, you can turn up this lower part here, have the curve kind of roll down like this, and you're just effectively boosting higher up. So there's really 2 things to take away from this here. There's the trick itself, which is cool. Okay, it applies here in this specific case, but it'll probably not apply to your kick because you have a different kick than I do, and you also have a different mix than I do. But you'll probably run into the same problems, and you've often been taught to just be very gentle with EQ, especially on the low end. And what I want to present to you is that you can move away from that if you know what you're doing, if you're doing it in a controlled way. Obviously, there was a lot of listening involved, there was a lot of checking involved, making sure that this didn't cause any issues that I didn't want to have. So the main takeaway here is that there is certain things that you can do that might be controversial, but still might help you. So for example, this 10 dB boost at 20 Hz is a very controversial thing to do in a normal mix. But in specific cases, it might sometimes be necessary. If you're making a drastic change, like displacing the tonality of a kick like this, not just slightly adjusting it like you would normally do with an EQ, but actually taking the energy from one spot and trying to place it in a different spot, then something more drastic like this is actually needed. So don't stick too much to the rules. If you feel like you can make your music sound better by doing something controversial, then do it, right? There's standard mixing techniques, but there's also edge cases and even things that fall outside of the rule where you have to take drastic measures. And this was one of the cases. So the second technique that I want to show you actually comes from the same project. And it comes from this bongo loop here, or dongo loop, or whatever I called it. This is it originally, and we're going to focus on these two dynamic plugins here. So just a little A/B for you to see what this technique does. Let's actually look into the technique here. What you'll see is that we're using two dynamics plugins here. And the first one is set up to be a gate. And then the second one, if I can find the window right there. Okay, so I managed to get both of them on the screen in a way that actually makes explaining this a little bit easier. What you'll see is that we have this gate here. And what this does is it takes any form of like reverb or background noise that's in the loop, which I had to deal with here, and it puts it out of the way first, so that when you apply compression, those bits get turned up again with the output volume that you add, and you kind of end up with a compressed signal where the reverb isn't starting to overpower the signal, or all of the little detail noises aren't going to overpower the main sounds of the signal. So this is a technique that I use basically always when I have to deal with something that I want to compress, but it already has a reverb and delay on it. And with the way that I work, this causes a bit of a problem because I like to add my delay and my reverbs into the production already before I go into mixing. Reason for that is I use delay and reverb as actual storytelling tools, because transitioning from one element to the next in Psytrance, there's usually a lot of space and you want to be able to already kind of know what the delay is going to do within the production. So I add it in the production. Obviously, if I was running everything dry and I was exporting everything dry, this wouldn't be an issue. I can add whatever compression I want to add, and then I can apply my delays and my reverbs. But that goes against the way that I work in my actual production. I want to know what the delay and the reverb is doing when I'm writing the song, because it's actual kind of an integral part of the sound, if you know what I mean. So I have to do it this way. The way you set this up is that you just have a gate, which, as you can see, is kind of just removing all of the lower bits, right? It's actually putting to silence a lot of the very low sounds. When I say low, I mean low in volume. If we zoom into this graph, I'm sure it will give us a reading. Yeah, anything under like 33 decibels will be put to complete silence, and anything kind of below, the threshold 26.6 will be set significantly quieter than if it was not going through the gate. So what we end up with just this is a very transient heavy signal, because all of the loud stuff is still coming through, which feels a little bit more staccato than the original, because all of the quiet in-between sounds are being turned off. So with just this, it sounds very staccato and very glitchy. And I can exaggerate the effect with the dry wet. You can hear the individual hits kind of coming through and the sound being kind of torn up by what this gate is actually doing. The fun thing with this technique is coming with the dry wet, because if we set this parallel, you can see what that does in the plugin. It kind of acts like a range knob, but in a different way. What a range knob will do is, if you set the dry wet to 100, it would just stop going below a certain line. So anytime you see it below a line, it would just be clipped off. But here you can actually see that it's kind of scaling the gain reduction. Right, all of those little peaks that we saw before, these peaks here, they get scaled down in size. So we're running this gate in parallel, meaning that also the dry signal is being pushed into here. And that's just to control the amount of effect that we have. And you can see down here the gain reduction. If we set this to 50%, you have a gain reduction of 6.02 dB, which just gives you an idea of the amount of control that you have. Anything that goes over that is less of an effect, and anything that goes above it is more of an effect. And I had this set at just over 50%. Now this is usually where I like it. I don't like to do like 20 dB of gain reduction, although this is possible with that technique. That will just push the quieter sounds out of the way even more, obviously. So once I had that gate set up, I just went into the compressor and I would compress it as I would normally. But I would keep into account the amount of reverb that it had before, kind of the sound that it had before. So I was still controlling the dynamic range primarily, but I was also trying to kind of get back up that reverb that were lost. Now, obviously with an output of just under 3 dB, we're not getting everything back, but with the way that I was doing it, I did like where this was sitting also in terms of reverb wise, not just the amount of compression that we have and the amount of loudness that we get out of the output. The output was specifically set with also the reverb in mind. So there's another problem that you might run into, and hopefully this is a solution for that. The next one that I want to walk into is not really a technique per se, it's more of a tool that I want just to bring to your attention. And that tool is LFOtool, because LFOtool for mixing tool is actually very, very powerful. Let me explain why. So here you can see my bass group, and this has my offbeat bass and my onbeat bass. Now, if you know my productions and you have seen some of my productions, you know that I like to separate my bass line into onbeat and offbeat. And the reason for that is because it allows me to do some nice things with the sub bass of the onbeat bass lines. Okay, so here I have it zoomed in a little bit. As you can see, the kick has a tail that kind of lasts up until this part here, which is the exact halfway point and which is where the offbeat part of my bass line starts. You can see that's where the bass line for the offbeat starts and the one for the onbeats ends. And this is something I just do in the synthesis part. So what I'll do is I'll go into this onbeat bass line, which will be a separate patch. It will be processed the same way, it will be set up the same way. What I do at the end of my productions is I just duplicate my bass line and then I separate them into offbeat and onbeat. What that allows me to do is it allows me to remove the sub bass from the actual patch and therefore not change any of the phase dependencies between all of the different frequencies in there. The phasing will still be the same on the bass line, but will just not have a sub there. Which means that I can push this louder before it starts competing too much with this sub here. And it also means that I don't have to do the kind of phase alignment that you hear a lot of Psytrance producers struggle with, because there's no sub bass to align to. I actually align on the transient, and I've talked about this in my latest bassline tutorial as well. Obviously, if you want to see a more in-depth way of doing your bassline, then obviously I recommend that you watch that. So where does LFOtool come in into all of this? Well, at this point, I just have my bass as audio. So I cannot really go back into the patch and mess with the phasing without kind of post-ringing going to overlap things, right? Anytime I do a lot of phasing on this bassline, it will start to overlap into the transient of this bassline. If I do a lot of phasing here, it will start to overlap on the transient of the kick. So I use LFOtool to separate these different areas. And I know I cannot really influence the transient that's sitting here. If I do a lot of phasing on this bassline, I will definitely mess up this transient here. So I still need to be careful. But I don't have to be so careful as if I did not have LFOtool. Because if we look into LFOtool, you can see that it just kind of selects the part of the song where I want the bass to actually play, and it removes parts of the song that I don't want the bass to play. So as a quick example here in the kick and bass, we can see this post-ringing here that sits in the waveform is just completely removed. It's completely silenced, which is exactly what I want, because this is where the transient of the kick sits. I don't want this waveform to start competing with the transient of my kick. Same is true for my onbeat bassline. If we look at the LFOtool for that, we can see it's just selecting this area of time where I want this bassline to play. This is the only part that it plays within the beat. So I can just loop this and have this LFOtool just kind of slice out just the parts that I need from a time perspective. Which means that I can do all kinds of phasing before again, and it will just be turned off whenever I need the other bass to come in, and I don't have to worry about any of the overlap that's actually happening there. So this is a very powerful way of using LFOtool. Another way that you can use LFOtool is like this. If we look into this LFOtool, you can see I don't have any particular selection shape set up, but I have kind of used it as a compressor, but in a way that it's much more controlled if you have that time dependency of, for example, a bassline. If you have a signal which you know is just gonna come in at 16 notes or 8 notes, you can just set the timing and you don't have to worry about anything. And you can use the various points and the various curves to just shape the sound however you want dynamically. So just as an example, this LFOtool here allows me to go from a stereo bassline that sounds like this to one that sounds like this. You can see what I'm doing is I'm removing the first transient, I am removing some of the later parts here, so that I just have a little bit of stereo right after the transient, and then it kind of takes over with the normal bassline again. It feels a lot more glued together with the rest. Obviously this mix was made with this LFOtool taking into account. So if I was to turn off the LFOtool, I would need to compensate for that by just turning down the overall level. Obviously, if I don't do that, it would be way too loud, as you heard in the example before. But this way, I have a neat little way to still have that stereo bass peek through right after the transient, deliver a little bit of stereo information, and not get into the way too much of the bassline. It does add its own little bit of texture, but it's not too much, right? It's very controlled. And I can do this because the bassline is just playing 16 notes. So as a takeaway from this, LFOtool is a great mixing tool. And it's not just a sound design tool or something that you slap on just for a little bit of sidechain. There's a lot of creative stuff that you can just do with a volume controlled LFO. And LFOtool also has a filter if you want to. The next track that I want to show you is a plugin that I use a lot if I need a sound that needs a little bit of extra air, a little bit of that very nice, very high end. So think 10 kilohertz and above, that kind of frequency range, that's the range that we're talking about. And for that I use Luftikus. So Luftikus is a free plugin and it emulates some kind of old EQ. I don't know the exact name of that, to be honest. But it features this very nice high boost shelf here. And as you can see, it's selected at 40k. Now, that doesn't really make sense if you think about it. 40 kilohertz is a lot higher than the frequencies that we can hear. But we talked about this before, how curves don't just influence the frequencies that you select. This curve is again going to bleed down into the audible frequencies, into 20 kilohertz, into 10 kilohertz, however it's designed. I can hear that it's doing something, even to the audible signal. So it is doing something to the frequencies that we actually hear. But setting it to 40k gives it this kind of curve that you don't really hear from normal EQs, because you cannot actually go that high in most normal EQs. There are some EQs that allow you to do that, but most EQs will limit you to the kind of range that you usually can hear the frequencies in. Anything up until like 20k, maybe 22.5, something like that. That's usually the maximum limit of an EQ that you're actually able to EQ. Now, quick little side note here. I don't use these bands often enough, but they are very, very good. They sound very, very good, especially for a free plugin. I do really like what this plugin does. What I do want to say though is that I've not really found any use for these lower bands here. I usually mess with this band, and if I really need to kind of shift the tone, I might occasionally like add a little bit or subtract a little bit here. I'm generally a lot like more gentle with these curves here. I never really draw it more than this, because these sound like they're very wide curves to me, kind of like with a very low Q factor, so they encompass a very large part of the spectrum. So they're really for kind of small tonal shifts and very minimal boosts and cuts. But for this high boost here, I generally am comfortable putting it up to like 5, 6, maybe even 7. That's starting to push it. Then usually it gets too bright. But usually anything between like 3 and 6 is a good value to start off with. Now, this is something that I specifically need to identify. This is not the kind of plugin that you throw on every channel and just boost and just forget about, right? This is something that you say, okay, this part of the mix is missing an element that provides very high end. I need some extra high end for that. This element has a little bit of that. Let's boost it using this EQ. Obviously, if there is no element in that part of the mix that offers that high frequency content, then you need to saturate it in. This is an EQ. It's not going to generate those frequencies for you. It's only going to boost them if they're already there. So keep that in mind. The next track that I want to show you has to do with this setup here. You can see an M set, then a Shadow Hills mastering compressor, and then another M set, which is acting on these plugs here. What I wanted to do is I wanted to do some mid-side compression, but very gentle compression, very gentle kind of gluing here. I wanted to take all of these 4 layers, which felt a little bit separated for me at the time, and I wanted to glue them together a little bit more. And I wanted to do that in, as I said, mid-side compression. But the Shadow Hill mastering compressor, the compressor that I wanted to use for this, does not offer mid-side compression, at least not the way that I used to. I don't think there's any button on the interface here that allows me to set up a mid-side compression where this will be your mids and this will be your sides. What you can do is set it to dual mono, which means that all of the interface parts that you see here, except this dual mono knob, right? All of this part here, all of this will be the left channel, and all of this right here will be the right channel. Which means that we need some kind of plugin or some kind of tool that puts the sides on one channel and the mids on the other channel. And that's where MSet comes in. As you can see, here's MSET, and this is set to encode mode. And then we have another MSET, which is set to decode mode. What this will do is it will put the sides into the right channel and the mids into the left channel, which allows you to separate them, and that allows you to process them independently, as we wanted. Now, as I said, the mastering compressor that I'm using here does not have a button to allow you to do that on its own. Most plugins, if I go to my standard EQ right here, allow you to just set it to mid-side processing, and then you can select a band or whatever process that you're using and only process the sides. If a plugin has this, then it's always better to just use this, because it saves you 2 slots in here and it just frees up a little bit of space. But if your plugin does not allow for this, and if you want to process the sides independently, then you need to make sure that obviously it can do left-right independent processing. You need to make sure that it can process the left channel in one way and the right channel in the other way. Otherwise, it's still completely useless. Otherwise, you still don't have the actual control over them. You still have them separated, but you don't have actual control over the individual left and the right channels. So keep that in mind. Also, specifically for compression and anything non-linear, keep in mind that the side signal is always going to be quieter than the mid signal in a well-produced mix. Because of monocompatibility, we tend to mix fairly narrow, and therefore the side signals are also quieter than the mid signals. The mid signals is also where the sub bass sit, which is a lot of kind of power and a lot of waveform, so that will be a lot of volume already right there, and that's just not present in the sides if everything is done properly. The last thing that I want to show you has to do with this automation right here. If I zoom into that, you can see that the automation is for dry-wet for an equalizer, which sounds a little bit strange, but let's explain the problem here. If I turn off this EQ, you might hear that towards the end here, there's a little bit of this annoying clog up of frequencies that starts to happen. Let's have a listen. I'm just going to isolate the sound, even though these decisions are normally made in the context of a mix. Let's listen to that again with the equalizer engaged. Specifically this last part, which is where really the clog up starts to happen. You can hear that it feels a little bit more spacey. And the way we're doing that is just with 2 cuts here. But the interesting part is what happens in this plugin when you tweak the dry-wet. If I tweak it up and down, you can see it's actually kind of like a scale knob here. And this is what I want to show with this trick, is that an EQ with a scale knob like this allows you to automate a certain EQ setup like this. And then it allows you to just target specific parts in time where you want that EQ to actually activate. So in this part here, this vocal sequence is getting louder. It's becoming more of a problem. So I'm actually turning up this EQ so that the frequencies that I want to tame actually become more and more tamed while this is getting louder. Another thing that I want to highlight that your EQ might have is something like this, which is a shift knob, which shifts your EQ around. And you can, if you have maybe a pitch bend on something, maybe say that you have a 24 semitone pitch shift upwards, you can just shift it along that time and it will follow that pitch shift, which is very, very useful. You don't have to buy one of those fancy key following EQs that you see a lot of in marketing. You can just do that manually whenever you have a pitch bend, and the EQ shape will just follow the sound along if you know and remember the shape of the pitch bend that you're using. So this was the final tip that I wanted to show you specifically in the DAW. The last thing that I want to talk about is that you probably have an idea of where you can implement all of these tricks, and you probably want to dive in as soon as possible and try all of these out. Don't force yourself to use these tricks. These are not things that I forced myself to use into a project, that I forced to incorporate into a project. These were all deliberate decisions. I want to do this now because I feel like this sound has this problem, which I need to fix in this way. And that's how you need to think about mixing. You go in there, you identify a problem with the sound, you identify a problem with, for example, a specific area in time, or maybe you have a specific sound that lacks some frequencies or that has too much of some other frequencies. And then you can start devising a plan on how you are going to actually tackle it. Are you going to use an equalizer? Are you going to use multiband compression? Are you going to use some kind of saturator setup? Are you going to use something very technical and very elaborate like mid-side processing because you have this very specific thing that you want the sound to do? Those are all the questions that you need to answer at that specific moment, and you need to make decisions based on those answers. And that's really the whole workflow, the whole setup here. Is what I want to show you is not so much these individual techniques, but the overall method that I use to identify a problem, identify a solution, and then implement the solution. So even though this video might be very finicky in that it shows very specific examples of the workflow, I hope that your main takeaway is going to be my main mixing workflow, how I identify problems, what kind of solutions I'm looking at, and what kind of ways I implement those solutions. So that's the main takeaway from the video, and that's also going to be the end of the video. Again, I hope you enjoyed this video like I do with all of my videos. If you did, you can let me know by leaving a like. If you want to ask me something about this or you have a specific suggestion for me, then let me know with a comment. Also, if you're new here and you say, this guy is interesting, I want to hear more of what he has to say, more of his tutorials, then you can subscribe to me, and you can even turn on the bell notifications if you want to get messages from YouTube whenever I upload something. But that's going to be the video for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye-bye.
In a very deep and bitter sense.